Hey everyone, welcome to Insomnia Stories X, a place for those who can't sleep and those who wish they could. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video. It really helps the channel grow. And if you're new here, subscribe and become part of the darkness with us. Turn off the lights, get comfortable. My name is David Katsuro, and I've worked for the National Park Service for 8 years. Before Glacier, I spent time at Death Valley and the Grand Staircase Escalante, positions that taught me silence and solitude are not metaphors. They're conditions you learn to live with, or they will consume you. When the opening came for a remote monitoring position at Glacier, I didn't hesitate. The salary meant nothing to me anymore. What I needed was distance. The job listing described it simply: year-round ranger stationed at Ptarmigan Lake Cabin, responsible for wildlife monitoring, trail maintenance reports, and emergency response for the sector, 12 miles from the nearest ranger station at Lake McDonald, 43 square miles of assigned territory. October through April, I would be the only person within walking distance, and walking distance in winter means nothing. The Park Service estimated response time in emergencies at 8 to 14 hours by snowmobile, assuming weather permits. I wanted that specific kind of emptiness. I was 42 years old, divorced 3 times, and had developed what a therapist once called aggressive self-sufficiency. What I heard was permission to stop trying. The Glacier position offered me the option to become invisible while remaining gainfully employed. The government would send supplies by helicopter once monthly during winter season. I would send monthly reports. Beyond that, I would exist in a territory that barely acknowledged human presence. The cabin was built in 1967, a 12 by 16-foot structure of lodgepole pine with a metal roof and a single large window facing south toward the lake. The Forest Service had upgraded it in the 90s. New insulation, a propane heater, a radio system. But these additions felt like cosmetics applied to something fundamentally unwelcoming. The floorboards were uneven, warped in places where water had found its way through gaps no one had thought to seal properly. The walls smelled like resin and decades of mouse droppings. I arrived in late September, when the aspen were beginning to turn. The drive from my apartment in Missoula took 6 hours. I flew into Kalispell with 2 large duffel bags and equipment I'd gradually accumulated: topographic maps, field journals, a weatherproof camera, bear spray canisters, water testing kits, and other instruments of isolation. The final leg was a rough Forest Service road that deteriorated into a hiking trail at the halfway point. I hired a local to drive my truck as far as the trailhead, then hiked in alone, my pack heavy enough that by mile 7 my shoulders burned and my breathing felt labored, despite my fitness level. The lake revealed itself through the trees without ceremony. It was perhaps 8 miles long and a mile wide, its water the color of slate under overcast sky. The cabin sat on a small inlet on the eastern shore, accessible by a rough track that had been gated to prevent casual visitation. I used the provided key code to open the padlock, something the Park Service changed quarterly, and found the gate corroded nearly to powder. The cabin's interior was exactly as uninspiring as I'd hoped. I spent my first night scrubbing surfaces, setting traps, and inventorying supplies left by my predecessor. The previous ranger, a man named Marcus, whose departure notes suggested he'd lasted 14 months before finding other work, had left detailed logs. His handwriting grew increasingly erratic after January, though this might have been the cold, or isolation, or simple cabin fever amplified by sub-zero temperatures and 14-hour nights. The job itself was straightforward enough. I maintained trails, took water samples from the lake and 3 tributary streams, counted elk using timed observation points, and documented any unusual wildlife activity. I was required to radio in every 3 days, a mandatory check that the Park Service used to monitor ranger welfare during remote assignments. The region was considered low risk for bears. Most activity occurred lower in elevation during summer months, but I was instructed to maintain vigilance. The radio came with bear bells attached by a frayed paracord, a charm as much as a tool. September passed in productive solitude. I established routines that structured my days. I hiked different sections of the territory, mapping water sources and marking problem areas. I noted wildlife, a mule deer doe with twin fawns, a black bear, small young, that visited the lakeshore at dusk, elk tracks in the alpine meadow above the cabin. At night I read books I'd brought, Cormac McCarthy, Annie Dillard, authors who understood landscape as narrative. I wrote in my field journal with a carefulness that felt almost religious. I realized, genuinely happy for the first time in years. The loneliness was profound and exactly what I needed. I had opted out of human complexity and received something pure in exchange. Direct perception of seasons changing, weather patterns altering visibility and sound, animal behavior unfolding without audience. I ate simple food. I slept deeply. In my report to the ranger station on October 5th, I noted all systems nominal and meant it. What I didn't mention in the report, what I wouldn't have had language for yet, was the feeling that had begun around late September. It wasn't quite paranoia, it was more the sensation of being watched from a distance by something that wasn't interested in harming me yet, only in determining what kind of thing I was. This manifested as small instabilities. I'd walk a trail I'd hiked 3 days prior and noticed that a fallen log had been moved. Not far, perhaps 3 feet, but definitively displaced from where it had rested. Animal work, I told myself. Elk, perhaps, or a bear searching for grubs. The park was full of forces that rearranged objects. Why should this feel wrong? The lake began to call to me. I found myself walking to its shore at intervals I hadn't planned, drawn by some impulse I couldn't articulate. In mid-October, I began making observations. The water held an unusual clarity. When I took samples at the established testing points, the measurements were exactly normal. pH, alkalinity, bacterial colonies all within expected ranges. But something about the lake's behavior felt off in a way that instruments couldn't measure. The deer stopped coming to the eastern shore. I'd noted the doe and her fawns appearing at dusk consistently during the first month. In October, they stopped. The bear still came, but its pattern changed. Previously, it had appeared at the same point 3 nights running, feeding on the vegetation near the outlet stream. Then one night in early October, I watched it approach that same location and abruptly stop 50 yards away, as if encountering a barrier. It stood for several minutes, and in the binoculars I could see its posture was wrong. Head tilted, ears forward, body language suggesting confusion or concern. Then it turned and loped away. Not running exactly, but moving with purposeful retreat. I told myself these were coincidences. Animals have complex drives. Deer move between territories. Bears respond to food abundance in other areas. There was no reason to interpret their absence as connected to anything. Yet I began to feel, with a clarity that preceded any logical thought, that I was watching an animal community withdrawing from something. Not from me, but from something else that shared the territory, and from which I somehow remained invisible. The first week of October, I found the first one. It was on the Northern Trail, a 4-mile hike from the cabin through dense subalpine forest. I was conducting a trail maintenance assessment, noting deadfall and erosion damage. The trail curved through a grove of particularly old whitebark pines, and it was here that I found the print. At first I thought it was a bear. The outline was broad, and the size was substantial. But as I crouched to examine it more carefully, the details became wrong. The print was hand-like, 5 distinct digits, the spacing of which suggested an opposing thumb. The depth was inconsistent, the heel pressed deep, as if the creature carried weight forward, while the toe regions were shallow, almost scraped. Whatever had made it had been moving bipedally. I photographed the print with my research camera and took measurements. The length was approximately 11 inches. The width, measured across the palm area, was 7 inches. I created a plaster cast, something I wasn't trained to do but accomplished through logic and a mixture of plaster patching compound I'd found in the cabin's supply shed. The cast held its shape but captured something the photograph hadn't, a texture on the sole that suggested calluses or scales, something that wasn't fur and wasn't skin. I spent the evening cross-referencing my field guides. The handbooks provided by the Park Service covered documented wildlife: bears, wolves, elk, Mountain goats, wolverines, lynx. Nothing matched. I found myself thinking about Bigfoot with an embarrassment that felt physical. I was a trained observer, a scientist of the landscape, and I was crouching in a one-room cabin considering cryptozoology like some credulous hiker who'd heard stories around a campfire. Yet I radioed the ranger station the following day and reported it directly. I described the print, provided measurements, and used professional language. My supervisor, an older man named Petrov whom I'd met once during orientation, listened without interrupting. "Probably a bear with an unusual gait," he said. "Joint damage from injury. Sometimes they do unusual things." "It's not a bear," I said. It came out with more certainty than I felt. "Well, it's not anything else." His tone suggested he was closing the conversation. "Do the usual protocol. Keep documenting. We'll have a ranger visit in November. He can check the area if there's evidence. For now, maintain standard precautions." I did. I hung the bear bells on my pack. I carried the bear spray, though my heart wasn't in it. And I began to understand, with a slow and unsettling clarity, that whatever was in my territory, and whatever the Park Service believed about wildlife in these mountains, I was moving into something that wouldn't be resolved by protocol. The solitude I'd sought had become less like peace and more like exposure. November arrived with a kind of violence. Snow came first as powder, then as wet, heavy accumulation that bent trees and buried trails. By mid-November, the cabin was fully isolated. The helicopter supply run arrived on schedule. A brief moment of contact wherein supplies were deposited on a small platform 30 yards from the structure, and I signed a digital clipboard confirming receipt. The pilot didn't ask questions and left within 5 minutes. I hauled everything inside, locked the gate again, and settled into a winter that would last 5 months. The isolation became geographical. The trails I'd walked became impassable. My assigned territory might as well have been the moon. I maintained my observation posts indoors now, using binoculars from the window to scan the lake and surrounding forest. I recorded weather data. I processed water samples taken before the heavy snow made sampling logistically impossible. I read, and I wrote, and I waited. The prints appeared with increasing frequency. The second one came on November 12th, 3 days after the first helicopter supply run. This time it was closer, perhaps half a mile from the cabin, in the forest that marked the transition from lakeshore to the steeper slopes beyond. I was tracking elk paths, trying to document their winter movement patterns, and I came upon it quite suddenly in a small clearing. This print was different. It was larger, approximately 14 inches in length, and deeper. The force imprinted had been substantial, but what made me stop breathing was the position. The print was centered on a boulder, a flat-top stone perhaps 3 feet across. The creature hadn't walked around the stone. It had walked directly onto it, and the print was pressed into the thin layer of frost and lichen covering the surface, as if the thing had simply stepped up from ground level without breaking stride. The positioning suggested something that thought nothing of vertical movement, that incorporated the landscape's topography into its locomotion with the carelessness of a human climbing stairs. I marked the location on my map and photographed the print from multiple angles. I made another plaster cast, though my hands were shaking enough that the result was imperfect. I sat in the clearing for 40 minutes, examining the surrounding area for additional evidence. There were no other prints, no scat, no sign of feeding or rest, just the single impression, perfectly placed on the stone, like a signature. That night I did something against protocol. I removed a bottle of whiskey from my supply. I'd brought 2, insurance against winter isolation, and drank enough that my thinking became loose and permissive. I sat by the cabin's single window and watched the forest, and I let myself wonder aloud what was out there. It didn't seem impossible. The mountains were vast, and science was always discovering species thought extinct or unknown. There had been mountain lions in these regions, animals that had returned from near extinction. Why not something else? Why not something that was large and intelligent and had learned to avoid the kinds of evidence that would prove its existence? Why not something that occupied the gaps between the documented world and the forgotten world, that had evolved in the spaces between human knowledge. The whiskey helped me accept my own rationalization. By the time I finished the bottle, I had convinced myself that what I was documenting was significant, was important, and was entirely real. The weather locked down in late November. Temperatures dropped to -18 Fahrenheit. The lake froze solid enough that I could see the ice thickening, could watch the surface crystallize into patterns that resembled neural pathways or cracks spreading through ancient glass. The trees became treacherous. Branches heavy with ice would drop suddenly without warning, the sound sharp as gunshots in the absolute silence of deep cold. This was when the elk began appearing. The first one was in the trees northwest of the cabin, visible through the binoculars on November 23rd. It stood motionless for approximately 40 minutes, facing the cabin. I watched it through magnification, and every detail I could see suggested something was wrong. The animal's posture was unnaturally rigid. Its ears were held forward constantly, which is not typical ear position for a resting or grazing animal. When I finally lost sight of it, it didn't walk away but simply seemed to fade from my scope view as the light degraded toward evening. I felt a specific kind of dread that my body understood before my mind caught up. More elk appeared over the following weeks. Always singly, always stationary, always watching in the direction of the cabin. If they were truly wild animals, their behavior was neurologically abnormal. Elk have excellent survival instincts. They don't stand exposed in sub-zero weather. They don't stare at potential threats for extended periods. They move constantly, feeding and evaluating their environment. These elk did none of those things. They stood, and they watched, and they held that vigil with a patience that felt engineered. I documented each sighting in my journal, recording date, time, duration, and location. By December 10th, I had documented 11 separate instances. Several were repeats, the same elk, I believed, based on distinctive markings, returning to the same location and resuming its watch from exactly where it had left off. The lake began to trouble me in ways I couldn't fully articulate. I would stand at the window and look at its surface, particularly at dawn or dusk when the light was oblique and gave the ice strange properties. The surface wasn't smooth. It had ridges and formations that shifted, or seemed to, depending on the angle of view and the quality of light. I'd attributed these to wind patterns and natural freezing architecture, but as November deepened into December, I began to see patterns in those formations, deliberate patterns, lines that suggested intention. On December 8th, I did something I hadn't authorized and hadn't told anyone about. I walked out to the ice, a walk of perhaps 200 yards from the cabin, and I examined the surface closely. What I found stopped me. The patterns weren't random. They were organized into a series of concentric circles, roughed into the ice surface with enough pressure that they hadn't sublimated away as the temperature fluctuated. The circles centered on a point approximately 400 yards from shore, in the deepest part of the lake where water would have been most powerfully displaced during the freeze. Something had stood in that location during the moments when the lake transitioned from liquid to solid, and it had rocked or shifted or simply pressed its weight in such a way that the freezing water had recorded that pressure. I stood at the edge of the first circle and measured them. There were 7 concentric rings, the largest approximately 80 feet in diameter. The depth of the impression decreased as you moved outward, suggesting the weight distribution of something with a relatively centralized mass point. My mind tried to generate explanations. A pressure hole from subsurface gas, released during freeze? That doesn't create perfect circles. Thermal differential patterns in the ice? That doesn't follow such rigid geometry. I stood there in -12-degree cold until my fingers went numb, and I tried to work backward from the evidence to the cause. What kind of organism or force could create this pattern? What would stand motionless in sub-zero water for the duration of a freeze cycle? What on this earth did that? I didn't have an answer, but I understood, with the kind of certainty that bypasses rationality, that something in my territory was more present and more real than I was. That I was the intruder, the anomaly, the thing that shouldn't be here. When I walked back to the cabin, I moved very carefully, and I didn't look behind me, which I understand now was superstitious and irrational, but which felt, at that moment, vitally important. The following day, I reported my findings to Petrov via radio. I described the patterns on the ice with as much professional objectivity as I could muster. I provided measurements and location data. I suggested it warranted further investigation, perhaps by other rangers or by a biologist who specialized in unusual phenomenon. There was a long silence on the radio. When Petrov's voice came back, it had a quality I recognized from my earlier life and relationships. The sound of someone deciding what truth they were willing to accept. "That's probably just ice forming," he said. "Pressure cracks and sublimation in cold weather. The lake freeze is a complex process. Lots of factors." "The patterns are geometric," I said. "This isn't random cracking. Thermal expansion and contraction creates geometric patterns all the time. Check your ice mechanics fundamentals, Katsuro." He said it with a tone that suggested he was offering correction, not dismissal. "Keep documenting. Standard protocols. We still have you on the schedule for a ranger visit the second week of January. We'll do a full territory sweep then." The conversation ended. I sat in the chair beside the radio and realized that I was being told, however indirectly, to normalize my observations into the framework of established knowledge. Don't challenge the category system. Don't suggest that something unmapped existed in the system. The Park Service wanted evidence of established animals, problems of human visitation, issues that conform to existing understanding. What they didn't want was proof that their territory contained something they couldn't categorize. The realization liberated me and terrified me in equal measure. December proceeded into deeper cold. The temperature rose above zero only twice in the final weeks of the month. The snow accumulated until the world became a study in white and black and gray, with only the visible portions of trees and rock providing contrast. The isolation became absolute. I existed in a space where normal rules seemed to have been suspended, where consequence and causality had become negotiable. This is when my visitors started coming to the lake. The first one appeared on December 19th, 3 days before the solstice. I was at the window in mid-afternoon, drinking coffee and watching the light move across the ice. The day was clear and cold, with visibility extending for miles into the white landscape. I saw movement on the lake's surface. A figure, bipedal, moving across the ice with a gait that suggested injury or profound asymmetry. I went immediately to the binoculars, my hands moving with the automatic precision that comes from having done something dozens of times. Through magnification, the figure resolved into something that my mind struggled to accommodate. It was human-shaped, in the sense that it had a head, torso, 2 arms, and 2 legs. Everything else violated that categorical claim. The proportions were wrong. The arms were longer than they should be, or the legs were shorter, or the torso was compressed in a way that made the overall figure seem to fold into itself when it moved. And the way it moved, it wasn't walking. It was something more like a shamble, a progression across the ice that suggested either profound damage to its skeleton or the simple fact that it was born into a biomechanics that didn't follow human logic. It walked in a straight line from the center of the lake toward the shoreline east of the cabin, moving at a pace that suggested purpose rather than panic. It didn't acknowledge the extreme cold or the exposed ice. It simply progressed, the distance closing with each shambling stride. I left the binoculars and went to the cabin door, an action that my brain framed as defensive but my body understood as completely inadequate. I stood in the doorway, my body heat already beginning to dissipate into the exterior cold, and I watched this thing approach the shoreline. It emerged from the ice and moved into the forest with the same shambling gait. For a moment I lost sight of it as it entered the tree line. Then it appeared again, perhaps 50 yards away and moving parallel to the cabin, at a distance that suggested it was circumnavigating my structure. I could hear it now, the sound of its movement through the snow, the breathing that came in patterns I couldn't quite identify as either human or animal. It completed most of a circuit and then, as if reaching a decision point, it simply stopped. It turned to face the cabin, and even without the binoculars, I could feel the weight of its attention. It stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, then it turned away and moved back toward the forest, the direction it had come from. Within minutes, it had disappeared beyond sight. I stood in the doorway for another 20 minutes, unable to force myself to close the door or move away. My body had entered a state of shock or profound adrenaline response. When I finally went back inside, I noticed my hands were shaking too badly to write. I tried to record the event in my journal and produced only illegible scrawls. I did radio to Petrov, breaking protocol by making an unscheduled call. "I saw something on the lake," I said. "A figure, human-shaped but not a person." Petrov's voice had changed. He was taking this seriously now. "No, something else. It was on the ice. It came to shore. I documented it. You need to send someone." There was a longer silence. When Petrov spoke again, his voice had that quality I'd recognized before, but stronger now. The sound of someone choosing which reality to inhabit. "Katsuro, can you describe this person?" "It's not a person. It's something else. Something that looks like it could be human but isn't." "Could it have been a hiker, someone in distress?" "No." I said it with absolute certainty. It was nothing like that. "We'll send someone," he said, though his tone suggested it was perfunctory, a compliance with protocol rather than genuine engagement. "January ranger visit will address this. For now, secure the cabin and document everything." He signed off before I could respond. I sat with the dead radio in my hands and understood that the institution had closed around the information I'd provided and sealed it off from genuine response. I would be taken seriously enough that a ranger would appear and file a report, but I would not be believed. What I had seen would be translated into official language and filed as wildlife encounter or possible human intrusion, categories that allowed the event to be absorbed into existing frameworks without disrupting them. I was alone with my observation. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the cabin with every light on, which was wasteful but which I couldn't bring myself to change. The generator hummed in the background, a sound I'd stopped noticing until this moment when it became my lifeline to power and artificial light. I watched the forest and the dark water, and I thought about the thing that had walked the lake. It had purpose. It had intentionality. It had decided to come here, to inspect this location, to move in ways that suggested investigation. Had it been hunting? It moved too slowly for that. Had it been curious? There had been something almost methodical in its approach. Had it been evaluating whether I was worth consuming? The second visitor came on December 21st, the solstice. This one was different. This one appeared to be human. I saw it in the afternoon light, walking along the frozen shoreline on the western edge of the lake, the side that faced away from the cabin but that I could observe with the binoculars from my window. The figure was dressed in what looked like typical hiking clothes, a blue jacket, dark pants, a backpack. It moved with a gait that was unmistakably human, and for a moment my primary emotion was relief. A human, actual contact, someone real to witness my isolation and confirm that I existed in a world that wasn't entirely defined by my perception. I grabbed the heavy parka hanging by the door and went out to the snow. The walk to the western shore took perhaps 15 minutes of hard walking through accumulated snow. By the time I reached the shoreline, I could see the figure more clearly, though it had continued its progress along the frozen lake surface, moving north. I shouted. My voice sounded thin in the cold. The figure stopped and turned to look at me. Even from 200 yards away, something was wrong. The way it turned was wrong. The head rotated first, too far, then the rest of the body followed in sections rather than as an integrated movement. The posture was human but arranged incorrectly, as if made by someone who had studied human anatomy from drawings rather than observation. I stopped moving forward. The distance between us held steady. I waited for it to wave or gesture or do something that would confirm the normalcy I was desperately needing. Instead, it tilted its head in that same rotational way, and even without seeing its face clearly, I understood that it was evaluating me. Then it opened its mouth. The sound that emerged was a human voice, but it wasn't right. The phonetics were distorted, as if passed through some kind of filter. It called out to me, and the words it used were my name. "David DDD," it said, the final consonant stretched impossibly long. "David DDD, come here." I was already backing away. My mind had accepted what my visceral response had recognized instantly. This was not a person. This was something wearing the shape of a person the way a hermit crab wears a shell, occupying the form without understanding its operation. "Come here," it repeated, and this time it moved forward with that shambling wrong gait, and I understood that it wasn't interested in distance, that the space between us was an obstacle to be overcome. I turned and ran. Behind me I heard it following, heard the snow compressing under its weight, heard that sound of wrong breathing. I have never run harder in my life. My lungs burned and my legs felt like they were moving through water, but I maintained speed and distance. I didn't look back until I'd reached the cabin and slammed the door. Through the window I saw it approaching, still moving in that shambling gait, still wearing a human shape that was becoming less convincing the closer it came. It reached the window and placed what looked like a hand against the glass, and when the light hit it from that angle, I could see that the fingers were wrong. Too many joints, or arranged in a sequence that twisted rather than bent. It held its hand against the glass, and the mouth opened again, and it repeated my name in that awful stretched voice. I went to the corner of the cabin furthest from the window and sat there with a heavy cast-iron kettle in my hands, completely irrational protection against something that clearly didn't require my body to be defenseless in order to pose a threat. The thing stayed at the window for approximately 6 minutes. Then it withdrew and walked around the cabin. I heard it testing the door and windows, moving with methodical persistence. I heard it, at one point, trying to open the chimney vent on the roof, the sound of metal scraping and the wind carrying dust down into the cabin's interior. It spent an hour circumnavigating my shelter, testing, probing, trying to find a way inside. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound of its investigation. It lingered beyond the reach of the lights, present but unseen, and I understood that it was capable of patience. It could wait. It had nothing but time, and whatever it was not governed by the same constraints that moved humans forward. Near dawn, I heard it move away from the cabin, its movement taking it toward the forest. By the time the sun rose, it was gone. I waited 3 hours before opening the door. When I finally stepped outside, I found tracks. The same footprints I'd found in autumn, but dozens of them, all around the cabin, circumscribing my space with cartographic precision. In many places, the prints pressed deep, as if the thing had stood in those locations for extended periods. At the window where it had tested the glass, the snow was compressed and the surface had crystallized with marks that looked like frost patterns, but that were far too regular, far too geometric. I spent the day scrubbing the psychological weight of those patterns from my mind, trying to rebuild the barriers between my interior world and the exterior reality that was pressing against them. By nightfall, I had convinced myself of something. I needed to leave, not report to the ranger station, not wait for the January visit. Leave. Get to the trailhead and never come back to this place. But when I looked out at the snow that covered everything, at the trails I'd mapped that were now impassable, at the cold that was absolute and indifferent, I understood that leaving was impossible. Winter had committed me to the territory. I was here until the world thawed, and something had claimed the winter and made it its own, and was using it to study me. The ranger visit came on January 8th, though January arrived with such complexity that the date felt uncertain by the time the helicopter appeared. The days between December 21st and January 8th were not linear. I understand this now as a symptom of stress and isolation, the way the mind fractures when exposed to sustained threat without the possibility of safety. I kept my journal. I can read it now and follow a sequence of dates and recorded events, but living through those days, they felt simultaneous, all happening at once, a constant state rather than a progression. The things continued to come, not every night, but frequently enough that I couldn't establish a pattern or predict when they would appear. Sometimes there was one. Sometimes there were 3 or 4, moving in coordination around the cabin, testing, observing. Their shapes varied. Sometimes they were more human. Sometimes they were closer to the first shape I'd seen, the one that moved with a gait that suggested broken biomechanics. Sometimes they were things that resembled deer or elk, but arranged wrong, with limbs that bent at angles that should have been impossible. They called. God, how they called. They used my name and the names of places I'd lived and people I'd known. They called out reports from my life, intimate details that nothing should have known. They tried to replicate my voice and almost succeeded, which was somehow worse than complete failure. Twice, I heard what sounded like another version of me, outside the cabin, having conversations with the things, and only my absolute refusal to look out the window kept me from learning whether they were actually successful at the forgery. They left gifts. On December 27th, I found a dead elk in the snow near the door. It had been fresh killed, the body still warm enough that the snow around it had melted into slush. But the kill was strange. There was no sign of predation. The animal simply appeared to have been stopped, all four legs bent under it as if it had been kneeling when something arrested its life. There were no visible wounds, no blood, no sign of struggle. I couldn't dispose of it in the snow. I couldn't burn it without making a fire visible from far away. I dragged it to the storage shed and left it there, sealed and cold, and tried not to think about what it meant that they were bringing me food. On January 1st, I found handprints on the cabin walls, human-like but not, 10 fingers on one hand, 7 on another, arranged in sequences that looked like writing or attempt at communication. They were made in a gray substance that I only understood when I tested it. Ash, somehow brought from far away, somehow pressed into the wood without breaking the surface. The radio communications became irregular. Petrov called on his schedule, and I answered with increasing difficulty. My voice had become unreliable. Several times I started to speak and couldn't continue, as if something was interrupting the signal between my brain and my mouth. When I did manage to communicate, I tried to describe what was happening, but the words came out distorted in ways that made me sound unreliable, possibly delusional. "We'll be there on January 8th, Petrov said on January 5th. "Just hold on." Hold on to what? I wanted to ask. Hold on to the certainty that I'm sane? Hold on to the belief that anything here is knowable? Hold on to the hope that another human will provide context that makes sense of this? But I didn't ask. I just confirmed the date and ended the communication. The ranger who arrived was named Garrison. He was younger than me, maybe 30, with the lean fitness of someone who actually lived outdoors rather than hiding in them. He came down from the helicopter with clear eyes and skepticism arranged around his mouth like a default expression. "Show me what you're so concerned about," he said, after a brief exchange of pleasantries. So I showed him. I showed him the plaster casts I'd made of the prints. I showed him my journal documentation. I showed him the photographs I'd taken of the patterns on the frozen lake. I showed him the tracks around the cabin, though some had drifted or melted into impressions too vague to read clearly. He examined everything with the careful attention of someone doing his job, but I could watch his skepticism solidify into certainty. He walked the territory with me for several hours, examining the forest and the lake and the cabin site. He found nothing ongoing, no new prints, no signs of the presence I'd described. "Could have been displaced by weather," he said, about the various physical evidence. "Your plaster casts are good documentation, but they could be anything. Not sure the print itself tells us much without a clear source." "I've been here for 3 months," I said. "I know what I'm seeing. There's something in this territory that doesn't match any known animal." "There's a lot we don't know about wildlife," Garrison said, and this was where I understood that he believed me in his rational mind, that my observations were possibly accurate, that the evidence was real. But believing in the existence of an unknown animal required a kind of paradigm shift that his training had not prepared him for, and his psychological needs demanded he reject it. "At night," I said, "there are things that approach the cabin. They're bipedal. They look almost human." "Okay," he said. "Okay. That's a little different than an unknown animal. That sounds more like—" He didn't finish. We both understood what it sounded like. It sounded like a person in isolation having a psychological crisis. It sounded like the beginning of a report that would end with my removal from the position and a psychological evaluation. "I'm not unstable," I said, though the moment the words left my mouth I understood how they sounded. "I didn't say you were." But his tone said he was considering it, was running through the diagnostics in his head, was developing an explanation that would make sense of my account while maintaining his understanding of the world. He stayed the night in the cabin, which was a mistake. That night, they came in force. I don't know how many there were. I didn't look. I could hear them moving around the cabin, hear them testing the structure, hear them attempting to communicate through the walls and windows. One of them had mastered my voice almost perfectly, and it spoke for extended periods in tones designed to provoke me, to make me respond, to break the isolation of my silence. Garrison sat beside the fire, and I watched his face as he listened to this. I watched him determine that what he was hearing was explained by wind, or imagination, or the way sound carries in mountains. I watched him organize the experience into categories that didn't require him to change his fundamental worldview. Weird acoustics, he said, when it became too loud to pretend he wasn't hearing it. Wind through the eaves of the cabin. Sound travels strange up here. It's not wind, I said. Probably is, he said, but his hand drifted toward the bear spray on his belt, which suggested that some part of him believed something else. By morning they had gone. The day dawned clear and bright, and in daylight Garrison's skepticism returned. He prepared to leave, called the helicopter, and was ready to board when I made the mistake of stopping him. Look at the ground, I said. I pointed at the area around the cabin. Look at the tracks in the snow from last night. Garrison stepped away from the helicopter and examined the ground. In the morning light, the tracks were visible. Dozens of prints, in varying shapes and sizes, all converging on the cabin from different directions. He stared at them for a very long time. These are fresh, he said. From last night, I confirmed. He crouched and examined the nearest print closely. Without saying anything, he pulled his phone and took several photographs. Then he stood up and said something that I'll carry with me for whatever remains of my life. Don't tell anyone about this, he said. When I file my report, I'm going to describe your station as secure and staffed by someone marginally overextended. I'm going to note some unusual wildlife behavior that could indicate an unknown predator, but nothing confirming, and you're going to resign. This week. What? I couldn't process what he was saying. You understand what these tracks would mean if they were verified, he said. You understand the implications. The Park Service doesn't want that. I don't want that. Nobody wants that. So you're going to resign your position, cite personal reasons, and this station is going to be marked as temporarily inactive pending new ranger assignment. There's something here, I said. People need to know. People need a lot of things, Garrison said. They don't get them. You discovered something that doesn't fit the maps, something that breaks the category system. The only thing to do with that is forget it or spend the rest of your life being discredited. Either way, it changes nothing about what's actually here. He got on the helicopter before I could respond. I watched it rise and turn, the sound fading into the white sky. I stood alone in my territory, and I understood with a clarity that felt like physics that I had been offered a choice and had just rejected it. That night they came again, but this time they were different. This time they came almost peacefully, moving slowly, making no attempt at entry. They simply formed a circle around the cabin, all of them, dozens of them, standing in the snow in shapes that ranged from almost human to something completely other. They stood there until dawn, and I watched them from the window, and I felt something that wasn't fear anymore. I felt recognition. On January 15th, I submitted my resignation to the Park Service. Personal reasons, family matters requiring my attention. The standard language for departure that asks no questions and demands no answers. The helicopter came to collect me on January 22nd. I left the cabin exactly as it was. I didn't clean or preserve anything. I packed a single bag and walked away, and I didn't look back until the forest had completely obscured the structure behind me. The trailhead had been cleared by Park Service maintenance. The drive back to Missoula was long and silent. I rented an apartment and haven't left it for the 4 months since my return. I'm not writing this because I think anyone will believe it. I'm writing it because it needs to exist, needs to be documented, needs to be placed into the public record so that if anyone else experiences what I experienced, they'll know they weren't hallucinating, weren't crazy, weren't misinterpreting signals from a fundamentally incomprehensible system. There is something in the mountains around Ptarmigan Lake, not one something, multiple somethings, operating in coordination, with purpose and intention. They study what comes into their territory. They test the boundaries of their space. They communicate in ways we don't have language for. The prints I found were real. The patterns on the frozen lake were real. The visits to the cabin were real. I have no doubt about any of it. What I was wrong about was my understanding of what it meant. I thought I was being hunted. I thought I was in danger. I thought the scenario was one of predator and prey, threat and defense. But that night when they formed the circle around the cabin, I understood the truth. They weren't hunting me. They were cataloging me. They were adding me to a list. This is a territory that goes back tens of thousands of years, maybe longer. In that territory, humans have come and gone. Indigenous peoples lived there for thousands of years. European settlers came and thought they understood the landscape. Ranger stations were built. People stationed there. People who thought they were observers and didn't understand they were being observed. We are being counted. Every person who comes into that territory is being documented, registered, added to a tally that stretches back in ways we can't measure. The thing I saw on the lake, the thing that appeared human but wasn't, I think it was a record keeper. I think it was there to process me, to understand what I was, to add me to whatever system of notation it used to track the human animals that wandered through its domain. The fact that I left alive means I was categorized as non-threatening, or possibly too fragile to be of interest. The fact that Garrison saw the tracks and did nothing except contain the information means that there is, somewhere in the Park Service, a protocol for managing this, not fighting it, not eliminating it, managing it. Letting it continue its enumeration as long as we maintain our silence. I'm breaking that silence because it needs to break. There are people reading this who have worked as park rangers, who have felt the weight of an observation they couldn't explain, who have heard sounds in the forest that don't match established categories. You're not insane. You're not misinterpreting data. There is something there, and it has been there for longer than we have names for. And it has a system for accounting for every human who enters its space. I don't know what it wants. I don't know what the enumeration is for. I don't know if it's dangerous or indifferent or capable of something that might be called emotion, but I know it's real, and I know it's present, and I know it has structures of knowledge and intention that we're not equipped to understand. Garrison's words stay with me. You discovered something that doesn't fit the maps. Either way, it changes nothing about what's actually here. He was right. I discovered something. It changed nothing. The thing continues its work in the mountains, cataloging the humans who pass through, maintaining its systems and records and intelligence that runs parallel to ours, but completely outside our awareness. I left the territory alive, which means they're still there, still waiting, still documenting. Which means the next ranger who goes to that cabin will feel what I felt, will see what I saw, will understand if they're honest with themselves that they are not alone in the way they thought they were. And when they leave and try to explain it, they'll be met with exactly what I was met with. The machinery of disbelief, the infrastructure of normal, the pressure to accept that what they experienced doesn't exist, couldn't exist, shouldn't exist, but it does. And it will keep doing what it does. Long after I'm dead, long after you're dead, long after everyone reading this has returned to the soil, in the mountains, by the lakes, in the territories that tolerate our brief presence before taking back their space. They're counting us. Document that. Remember it. When you feel watched in the wild places, when you sense attention from something that has no name and no category, understand that you're right. You're being registered. You're being added to a list. The enumeration is ongoing. It will never be complete. I took the job at Glacier National Park because I needed to disappear. That sounds dramatic, I know, but it's the honest version. After 6 years managing a district office in Sacramento, I'd reached a point where the fluorescent lights and quarterly reports felt like slowly suffocating under fluorescent light. My ex-wife moved on. My daughter grew old enough not to need me on weekends, and my therapist gently suggested that maybe a change of environment might do me good. When the position came open for a seasonal ranger at the park, I applied within hours. My name is Cade Mercer. I'm 53 years old. and I've been living in those mountains for 8 months now. The interview process was straightforward. They needed someone experienced with backcountry patrol, comfortable with isolation, and capable of managing emergency situations across the park's 1.2 million acres. I had all those qualifications from my college years working in the Sierras. What they didn't ask about was my motivation, and I didn't volunteer it. They assigned me to the northeastern section near Bowman Lake, where visitor density drops significantly once you move beyond the main corridor. Roughly 40 square miles of jurisdiction, most of it accessible only on foot or horseback. The cabin sits on a ridge overlooking the lake, about 2 miles from any marked trail. Built in the 1970s by the Park Service as a backcountry ranger station, it's the kind of structure that exists more out of obligation than necessity. 4 walls, a wood-burning stove, a propane refrigerator, and a radio that crackles with static more often than actual dispatch. The previous ranger had rotated out 3 months earlier. He'd left behind a logbook filled with mundane entries. Visitor counts, trail conditions, weather patterns. I arrived on the last day of March, when the snow still covered everything above 5,000 feet. The nearest town, Kalispell, was 50 miles south by car. The nearest ranger station was 12 miles away. Isolation wasn't something I found disappointing. It was the entire point. The first weeks were almost meditative. I hiked the patrol routes, documented trail conditions, responded to a handful of park visitors who'd wandered off map. The work involved a lot of walking, a lot of observation, and a lot of time alone with my own thoughts. The sun stayed up longer each day. The aspens budded. Snow retreated to the higher elevations. Everything moved forward in its natural progression, and I found myself falling into rhythms I hadn't felt in decades. In May, I found the first set of tracks near the western boundary. They appeared about 3 miles from the cabin, pressed deep into the soft earth alongside Bowman Creek. At first, I thought they were bear tracks. The footprints were roughly that size, maybe 8 inches across, with what looked like claw marks extending from each toe. But the spacing was wrong. Bears don't walk in straight lines the way these prints did. The gait suggested something bipedal, or at least something that switched between 4 legs and 2. The tracks ran alongside the creek for roughly a quarter mile before disappearing into dense lodgepole pine. I documented them in my patrol log and called it in to District Supervisor Marcus Reed at the main ranger station. Marcus had been with the Park Service for 28 years. He'd seen everything, or so he claimed. "Probably just a bear," he said over the radio. "They've been more active than usual. The winter was mild." "These don't look like normal bear prints," I said. "You'll learn," Marcus replied. "Mountain gets into your head sometimes. You start seeing patterns that aren't there." I let it drop, but I kept watch. Over the next 3 weeks, I found more tracks. They appeared in different locations, sometimes near the cabin, once on the trail leading up to the highest overlook, once circling what looked like old campsites that hadn't been used in years. The pattern suggested curiosity, or perhaps surveillance. Then, on a Tuesday evening in late May, I found the deer. It was lying near the edge of the lake, about 100 yards from the cabin. A mule deer, maybe 4 years old, positioned on its side with its legs extended outward in an unnatural arrangement. No visible wounds, no signs of predation. The eyes were still open, clouded over with the beginning stages of decomposition, but the body was fresh. It had been there less than a day. I examined it carefully, wearing gloves from my emergency pack. The legs showed faint markings where something had gripped them, but there were no bite wounds. The throat was intact. The internal organs hadn't been scavenged. It was as though the animal had been carefully placed there, positioned with deliberation. I removed the body to a location far from the cabin and filed another report with Marcus. This time, he suggested I might be having some difficulty adjusting to the isolation. "Happens to a lot of rangers," he said. "The first season is rough. You're alone most of the time. Your mind starts filling in gaps." "I didn't imagine a dead deer," I said. "No, but you might be interpreting its presence in a way that's more dramatic than the reality. Predation happens. Scavengers are opportunistic." I didn't argue, but I knew what I'd seen. There was nothing predatory about that arrangement. That was display. That was message. By early June, visitors started appearing on the trails more regularly. Summer season was beginning, the park filled with families, couples, and solo hikers looking for elevation gain and photo opportunities. I encountered at least 2 or 3 groups per week now, and most interactions were routine. I checked permits, offered trail advice, and pointed out the best overlooks for sunset photographs. But some interactions were different. One afternoon I found a woman about 4 miles from the cabin, standing on a ridge completely motionless. She wasn't looking at the view. She was facing the dense forest to the north, not moving, barely breathing. When I approached and identified myself, she seemed to come out of a trance. "Did you see it?" she asked. "See what?" "The thing. In the trees. It looked like a person, but it was walking like nothing I've ever seen. All wrong in every way." I asked her to describe it more clearly. She struggled. The description kept changing. Sometimes she said it was very tall, sometimes that it was hunched over, sometimes it was moving on 2 legs, sometimes on 4. The only consistent detail was that something about it wasn't right, like it was wearing something, like it was pretending to be human. I walked her back to the main trail and suggested she speak with a ranger at the visitor center about what she'd seen. I didn't mention that this was the 3rd such report I'd received in as many weeks. I'd stopped filing them after the 2nd encounter, sensing Marcus's skepticism would only solidify if I continued documenting what he'd already categorized as paranoia. The call came through on my radio at 6:47 p.m. on a Thursday, crackling with urgency that was unusual for the calm-voiced dispatcher at the main station. "All Rangers, we have a missing person report in the northeast sector. 23-year-old male, last seen at the Bowman Lake trailhead at approximately 4:30 p.m. this afternoon. He was on an unmarked route. Family is on site and requesting immediate search coordination." I was already moving toward the cabin when the transmission finished. I grabbed my emergency pack, water, first aid, rope, flare, radio, and the rifle I kept locked in the closet, a .30-06 that I'd never needed to fire in anger. The sun was dropping toward the horizon. I had maybe 90 minutes of good light left, maybe 2 hours of twilight after that. The trailhead was 2.5 miles from my cabin. I moved quickly, my pace aggressive enough to feel urgent but controlled enough to stay safe on the uneven terrain. When I arrived at the parking area, I found a pickup truck and a middle-aged couple standing by the ranger kiosk. The man was pacing. The woman had her arms wrapped around herself despite the mild evening temperature. I identified myself, and the man rushed toward me. "He went up this morning," the father said, speaking quickly. "Up toward the ridge. He said he'd be back by dark. He's a strong hiker. He grew up hiking. But he's not back, and he's not answering his phone. Well, there's no signal up there anyway, but he said he'd check in when he got back to the car. He said 6:30. He always keeps his word." "What's his name?" I asked. "Jerome Hartley." I radioed the main station and requested additional rangers to the trailhead. Marcus responded that 2 rangers were en route and would arrive within an hour. I asked for a helicopter, but Marcus said it was too late in the day and the weather was clear enough that ground search made more sense as a first priority. "I'm heading up the ridge," I told the parents. "Can you describe exactly which direction he went?" The mother pointed toward the thick forest to the north of the trailhead. "He showed us the route on his map. There's an old fire lookout post up there. He wanted to see if he could find it." The lookout post had been abandoned in the 1980s. It wasn't on any official trail, and the Park Service generally discouraged backcountry bushwhacking. But the route wasn't unknown. Locals and experienced hikers occasionally scrambled up to it for the views. I headed into the forest with my headlamp off, navigating by the last of the ambient light. The underbrush was dense, and the slope was steep enough to require handholds in some sections. I moved carefully, calling Jerome's name every 100 yards or so, stopping to listen for a response that never came. By the time I reached the ridge, the light was nearly gone. The old lookout post was a skeletal structure of weathered wood. The stairs rotted away decades ago. The observation platform accessible only if you were willing to climb an exterior ladder that looked like it would splinter at a touch. I searched the immediate area with my headlamp, looking for any sign that Jerome had reached this location. That's when I found the footprints. They were everywhere around the lookout post, so numerous that they formed overlapping trails in the soft earth. and they weren't all human. Some of them were clearly tracks like those I'd been finding near the cabin, bipedal, with that strange, deliberate spacing, but mixed among them were prints that looked almost human but subtly wrong. Too long, too narrow. The toe spacing extended unnaturally far. I stood in the middle of that chaos of prints and felt something crystallize in my mind. These tracks had been made recently, perhaps within hours. They circled the lookout post repeatedly, as though whatever had made them had been investigating, studying, perhaps waiting. "Jerome?" I called out, my voice louder than before. "Jerome Hartley, if you can hear me, make some noise." The forest stayed silent. I searched the area in expanding circles for the next 2 hours, moving carefully, calling out at regular intervals. I found nothing. No sign of Jerome. No clothing, no backpack, no indication that anyone had been here besides the things that left those tracks. By 9 p.m., the other rangers had arrived at the trailhead. Marcus had sent 2 of them plus himself. When I radioed down and described what I'd found, Marcus insisted I return to the trailhead and help coordinate the wider search instead of continuing alone in the dark. The search lasted for 3 days. We brought in volunteers from Kalispell, set up base camp at the trailhead, and organized multiple teams to cover the backcountry in grid patterns. We found nothing. No Jerome, no gear, no indication that he'd ever made it past the base of the ridge. The Park Service issued a press release about a missing hiker. The family drove back to their home in Iowa, and on Sunday evening, Marcus officially classified Jerome Hartley as a missing person, expanding the search beyond Glacier Park to include the national forest adjacent to the park. By Monday it was regional news. By Wednesday it was forgotten, replaced by stories about a heat wave in the Midwest and a politician's scandal. I stayed in my cabin and watched the forest. Something changed after Jerome disappeared. The tracks intensified. Where before I might find signs every few days, now there were tracks every single night. They appeared around the cabin itself, pressed into the dirt beneath my windows, forming circles around the perimeter like something, was studying the structure. I began sleeping with the rifle loaded and positioned beside my bed. I kept the cabin doors locked, though I'd never bothered before, and I started a log of every activity I could document, noting times, locations, and descriptions with obsessive precision. June turned to July. Summer visitors packed the main park facilities, but few ventured into my remote section of the northeastern district. I filed reports with Marcus, brief and factual, sticking to observable details without interpretation. He didn't ask follow-up questions anymore, but he also didn't suggest I was imagining things. I'd stopped bringing it up, and he'd stopped dismissing it. An unspoken agreement had developed between us. I would document what I observed, and he would receive the reports, and neither of us would elaborate beyond that. On the night of July 14th, I heard sounds outside the cabin, not animal sounds. I was sufficiently experienced to recognize the various vocalizations of mountain fauna. These sounds were different, almost like voices, but distorted, as though coming through water or through a thick fog. The sounds were followed by what I can only describe as scratching, a prolonged, persistent scraping against the wooden exterior of the cabin. I sat in bed with the rifle across my lap, listening, trying to determine location and distance. The sounds seemed to come from multiple points around the structure simultaneously, which was impossible unless there were multiple entities, which I was beginning to suspect there were. At 2:47 a.m., according to my headlamp's LED display, I heard something that stopped my heart. It was a human voice, male, weak with exhaustion. "Help, someone help me." I was off the bed and at the window before rational thought could catch up. Outside, in the moonlit clearing around the cabin, I saw a shape. It was roughly human-shaped, standing on 2 legs about 30 yards from the cabin's eastern wall. It was completely still. "Hello?" I called out through the window. "Identify yourself." The shape didn't respond. "I'm Ranger Mercer with the National Park Service. I'm armed. Identify yourself or I'll be forced to assume you're a threat." It took me a moment to realize that the shape had moved. It was now 50 yards away, having backed up silently. When the moonlight hit it properly, I could see that it was extremely tall, well over 6.5 feet, and its proportions were subtly incorrect. The arms were too long, the legs bent in ways that looked wrong even by the moonlight's distorted illumination. I grabbed my radio and called for backup, my voice steadier than my hands. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Mercer at the Bowman Lake Station. I have a situation. Possible intruder on the property. Request immediate assistance." The radio crackled. Marcus's voice came through, thick with sleep. "Cade, what kind of situation?" "Someone is outside the cabin. I've identified myself, but they're not responding. They've retreated to approximately 50 yards from the structure and are still visible." "Can you describe them?" Marcus asked. "Male, approximately 6.5 feet tall, wearing dark clothing, standing motionless." There was a pause. "Stay inside. Lock the doors. I'm calling in additional rangers now." But even as Marcus was saying this, I was watching the figure move again. It turned, and I use that word deliberately because it rotated its entire body in a manner that suggested the head and torso moved as a single unit, and walked into the forest with a gait that was distinctly inhuman. Not running, not even hurrying, just walking, with a smoothness and a length of stride that no normal human could achieve. When the rangers arrived 40 minutes later, they found nothing. No tracks other than my own from where I'd gone outside with the rifle, scanning the tree line. No signs of disturbance. Marcus reviewed the cabin carefully, checking for evidence of attempted entry, finding nothing. By the time dawn broke, the consensus among the rangers was that I'd seen something. Perhaps a hiker, perhaps a large animal that the moonlight had rendered more ominous than it actually was. Only Marcus, at the very end, asked me a direct question. "Are you okay, Cade? I mean, really okay?" I looked at him directly. "No, I don't think I am." He nodded slowly. "This job can be hard. The isolation, the vastness. We're small out here. Some people handle that better than others." "I know what I saw," I said. "I believe you did," Marcus said. And something in his tone suggested that he actually meant it, that he believed I'd witnessed something, even if he wasn't certain what. "But I think you need to consider whether you're in the right frame of mind to continue working up here." "If I leave, they'll stop," I said. It wasn't a question. Marcus didn't respond. He gathered the other rangers and they drove back to the main station, leaving me alone again with my documentation, my rifle, and the certainty that something was very wrong in the forest around Bowman Lake. In the weeks following the nocturnal visitor, I found myself developing a routine that was part scientific observation and part psychological self-preservation. I documented every sound, every track, every disturbance. I installed motion-activated lights around the cabin and set up a trail camera aimed at the forest's edge. I stopped going into the backcountry except when absolutely necessary, and only then with the rifle, a handgun in my belt, and a machete attached to my pack. The visitors came regularly now, not every night, but frequently enough that I began to recognize patterns. They would arrive around midnight, move through the clearing in ways that suggested communication, and then retreat into the forest by dawn. Some nights there would be only one. Other nights I counted at least 3 distinct shapes, each moving with that same wrong-articulated fluidity. The sounds changed as well. At first they'd been purely animalistic, those distorted vocalizations that seemed neither human nor beast. But gradually they began to incorporate actual human sounds. I'd hear fragments of speech, most of it too garbled to understand, but occasionally a word or phrase would come through clearly. "Come out," I heard one night. The voice sounded like it was imitating Jerome's voice, but the cadence was subtly off, like a skilled impressionist who'd almost perfected the mimicry but couldn't quite capture every nuance. "I don't want to be alone," came another night, in a woman's voice that I didn't recognize but that contained genuine emotion, something that made my stomach turn because I understood what I was hearing. These weren't just animals or some unknown creatures. They were something that learned, that adapted, that understood human speech well enough to use it as bait. I stopped responding to the voices. I stopped going to the window. I moved through the cabin only when necessary, keeping to the interior, away from the light. It was during one of these self-imposed vigils that I finally made a decision I should have made weeks earlier. I contacted Marcus and told him I was requesting to end my seasonal contract early. Effective immediately, he asked. Yes, I can process that paperwork today. You can pack and be out by tomorrow. There was no judgment in his voice. If anything, he sounded almost relieved. I want you to know, he said carefully, that you're not the first ranger to experience this. I didn't respond immediately. When I did, I asked, "What are they?" Marcus was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, more deliberate. There are stories, going back a long way. The local native communities have warnings about certain areas of the park. We don't advertise it because it sounds like superstition, and this is a place of science and parks administration. But the warnings exist. They talk about things that aren't what they appear to be. Things that watch. Things that take the shape of people sometimes, but aren't people. Skinwalkers, I said. The word came from somewhere deep, from memories of late-night conversations around campfires during my younger years, from half-dismissed stories that I'd never quite believed until now. That's what they're called, Marcus confirmed. Not in any official capacity. But yes, some rangers learn to coexist with certain presences in remote areas. Some just can't handle it. The Park Service doesn't acknowledge it officially. If I were filing a report about this conversation, I wouldn't include it. But unofficially, yes, they're here. They've always been here. They're part of what makes this place the way it is. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. Would you have believed me? Would you have taken the job? I considered this. He was right. I wouldn't have. I probably still wouldn't have, even with a warning. I'd needed the isolation. I'd needed somewhere to hide, and they'd known that. Somehow they'd known that. What happens if I leave? I asked. They'll stop visiting the cabin. They'll retreat. They're not aggressive unless you engage them, unless you try to interfere with what they're doing. Jerome got curious. He went looking for something, and he found something. He made a choice, even if he didn't understand he was making it. They ate him, I said. No, Marcus said quietly. I don't think they did. I think he made a choice to go with them. Maybe still is making that choice. I hope he is. It would be kinder than the alternative. I drove out of Glacier National Park the next morning. I've been gone for 14 days now. I'm writing this in my apartment in Sacramento, the same one I left 5 months ago. Sitting beneath those fluorescent lights, I thought I'd escaped. I'm trying to make sense of what happened in that remote section of the park. And I'm trying to decide whether any of this should be shared with someone who might actually investigate it. The footage from my trail camera arrived on my personal email 2 days ago. I don't know how it was sent. The email was blank except for an attachment, but the footage is clear. It shows the clearing around the cabin over a period spanning 4 months. It shows the creatures as they approach, their movements, their behavior. It shows them circling the cabin at night, and it shows something else. Something that I've spent 2 nights verifying through multiple viewings. It shows me, or something wearing my face. In the footage dated July 15th, approximately 12 hours after I called for backup, there is a figure that looks exactly like me, down to the specific hiking clothes I was wearing. It moves around the cabin's clearing with that same fluid, wrong articulated grace as the others. It turns to face the camera, and I know it's looking directly at the lens, aware of its presence, and the smile on that face is too wide, stretches too far, the teeth too numerous. I haven't been entirely alone in this apartment since I returned. The sounds started 3 days ago. A scratching at the windows that I keep curtained now, voices in the walls, and sometimes when I'm not quite awake and not quite asleep, I hear something trying to use my voice, practicing the cadence and inflection of my speech, getting closer to perfection with each iteration. I don't know if what came back with me is actually me or something else wearing my shape. I don't know if the version of myself that left the cabin that morning is the same version writing these words. Consciousness doesn't feel fractured, but that might be precisely what something designed to mimic consciousness perfectly would think. What I do know is that Marcus was right about one thing. They don't kill. They accommodate. They absorb. They wait for people like me. People broken enough, isolated enough, desperate enough, and they offer a kind of belonging. They don't attack. They invite. And the terrifying part is that the longest I felt close to accepting one of those invitations was in the days right before I left, when the sounds stopped being threatening and started being almost familiar, almost comforting, almost like the sound of acceptance. I've kept this detailed account because someone needs to know what happens in that remote corner of Glacier National Park. Not for any official purpose, not to warn people, because the warning never stops anyone who really needs to get lost, but because there's something about rendering this experience into language that helps anchor me to whatever version of myself I still am. If you're reading this, and you're thinking about taking a job in the backcountry, in any remote corner of this vast country, please understand what you might encounter. Not all presences in wild places are hostile. Some of them are simply waiting for someone to make a choice. Some of them are incredibly patient. And some of them, if you're very quiet, if you listen very closely to the sounds that don't quite match any known animal, if you watch the tree line long enough, some of them might be wearing faces you recognize. They might be wearing your face. My name is Ian Crowfeather, and I accepted this job because I needed to disappear, not in the romantic sense. I wasn't running from heartbreak or failed dreams. I was running from myself, or perhaps toward something truer. The ranger station at Glacier National Park, specifically the Northern District covering 200,000 acres of backcountry, required a solo position. The pay was garbage. The isolation was severe. Nobody wanted it. In my background check interview, the director seemed almost relieved I'd agreed, as if they'd been about to leave the post empty rather than staff it with someone suitable. That should have told me something. I'd worked 8 years in a Portland office tower, climbing walls while sitting in meetings, my mind calcifying into spreadsheet patterns. My father was a biologist who'd spent his last years studying wolf pack dynamics in Montana. He died at 53, and his final letter to me, which I didn't read until 3 months after the funeral, said he'd regretted nothing about his small life in big spaces. He hoped I wouldn't regret my small soul in smaller rooms. I read that letter in a conference room bathroom at 2 a.m., sitting on a closed toilet with my chest tight. By morning, I'd submitted my resignation. The job posting had appeared while I was still unemployed, sleeping until noon, learning nothing. It asked for 3 years ranger experience, wilderness first aid, wildlife management training, and a person comfortable with extended isolation and radio-only contact for weeks at a time. The final line noted that the previous ranger had requested reassignment after 14 months. I had the qualifications. I had nothing else to lose. Glacier's northern station meant I'd be based at Ravine Camp, a cabin built in 1987 on the shores of Coulter Lake, positioned roughly equidistant between Whitehorse Ridge and the Belly River confluence. The location was deliberately remote, close enough to monitor backcountry violations and wildlife issues, far enough that most day hikers never reached it. The nearest ranger station was at West Glacier, 40 miles south. The nearest town with supplies was Browning, 60 miles by Mountain Road. I drove up in late April after the worst snow had cleared, when the park was just beginning to open its interior trails. The cabin revealed itself gradually as I hiked the final 4 miles in from the truck parking area. First the weathered A-frame roof through the larch, then the front porch with its gaps showing between the planks. Finally the full structure. Small, utilitarian, and more isolated than I'd anticipated even knowing the coordinates. The lake behind it stretched gray and cold, still partly iced at the edges. The silence was profound in a way silence isn't supposed to be. Not peaceful but active, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The previous ranger's files had been thoroughly archived, every patrol logged, every radio check documented, every incident reported. His name was Robert Vesey. His entries became shorter over time, more terse. The final month of his reports before his reassignment request contained one notable entry: August 14th, found deer carcass, 5 miles north of cabin, extreme disarticulation, possible wolverine predation, area sealed for safety, bones scattered in pattern I've never observed, noted for investigation on next patrol. The next patrol never happened. Vessie's reassignment came through 3 weeks later. My first week, I cataloged the cabin supplies, reviewed the GPS coordinates of known danger zones, unstable ridge overlooks, avalanche paths, stream crossings with poor sight lines. I walked the property, checked the water system, tested the radio. Everything functioned. The cabin was cleaner than I expected, as if someone had made an effort to make it unpleasant from the moment they left. By the second week, I'd begun my regular patrol circuits. Spring brought work, winter damage assessments, trail maintenance, preparation for the summer hiking season. My days held structure. My evenings were absolute quiet. I read books by the cabin's wood stove and watched the lake gradually lose its ice. On May 8th, I found the first sign. It was a mile north of the cabin, on the secondary trail toward Whitehorse Ridge, in a place that had no business hosting wildlife. The spot was exposed and high, with dangerous footing and no shelter. Yet something large had died there recently. The carcass was a mountain goat, partially decomposed, its wool matted with something dark. But the strange element was the positioning. The animal had been placed, that was my immediate instinct, correct or not, with its forelegs extended upslope, its hind legs folded beneath it, its head twisted at an angle that would require deliberate breaking of the neck. Around it, in the thin alpine soil and scattered stones, were tracks. I'd seen grizzly prints, elk, bighorn sheep, wolves, and once, a wolverine. These tracks were different. They were enormous, human-shaped in the way a shadow becomes human-shaped, but with the weight distribution wrong, heavier on the forward parts of the feet, as if the creature walked perpetually forward, perpetually in a crouch. I marked the location, photographed everything with my phone, and radioed it in to West Glacier as a wildlife incident. The response was bureaucratic and distant. They'd send someone up in a few weeks for a proper investigation. For now, mark the area off limits, check back in 10 days, and log any additional findings. I marked it off. I checked back in 10 days. The carcass had been disturbed. Large sections of hide had been stripped away, exposing the ribs beneath. But here's what my 8 years in Portland had not prepared me for. Goat carcasses in the high country don't strip their own hides. Weathering does that, but slowly, and usually from the inside out through decay. This skin had been removed with purpose. The tracks around the new scavenge site were the same, enormous, vaguely human, and multiplied now. There were at least 3 distinct sets, all converging on the corpse, all oriented away from the nearest structures or trails, toward the deeper wilderness, toward the ravines. June brought heat and tourists. Families hiked the lower trails. Rangers did their community outreach, and I settled into a rhythm of checking permits, maintaining trail systems, and pursuing what had become an obsession, finding more evidence of the tracks. I told myself it was professional. I told myself it was a potential predator issue that needed investigation. Really, it was something else. It was the recognition of a presence that hadn't been in the cabin's logs, hadn't been noted in Vessie's careful entries, and was large enough and strange enough that it forced me to acknowledge why he'd really requested reassignment. He'd felt something. He'd decided it was inimical to his continued survival. The marks and signs accumulated through June in a way that would seem impossible in a heavily monitored national park if you hadn't spent weeks in the actual vastness of it. The park has 1,000 miles of trails and 1 million acres. The Ranger Corps covers maybe 2% at any given time. Everything else belongs to what lives there. I found a second goat, similarly disarticulated, on the high ridge past Gunsight Lake. 3 more elk carcasses in a ravine north of Whitehorse, arranged in a line like a macabre fence. The arrangement of each grew more deliberate. The stripping of meat and hide grew more methodical. And always the enormous tracks, now accompanied by something worse. Scat that was human-shaped and human-colored but contained fur and bone fragments in an order that suggested a consumption pattern I couldn't quite calibrate to any known carnivore. In mid-June, I found human evidence. It was a campsite that had no business existing in the backcountry. National park policy forbids camping outside designated sites. Yet someone had established a semi-permanent installation about 6 miles northeast of Ravine Camp, in the transitional zone between the valleys and the high peaks. The tent was a good one, a modern Coleman, expensive but abandoned, with its contents scattered around the fire ring as if the occupant had fled abruptly. Inside I found a journal with entries dated to March, a backpack with depleted food supplies, a rifle, a Remington 700, positioned on a tripod pointing toward the surrounding forest. The journal's final entry, dated March 18th, read, "Still here, still waiting for it. The prints come closer every night. I know it's testing the perimeter. I know it's learning my pattern. I have 14 rounds left. That will either be enough or it won't. If anyone finds this, don't attempt to hunt it. It's not an animal. It's not wildlife management. Some things can't be managed, only endured." The author had signed the entry with initials DM. The journal predated my arrival by 5 weeks. There was no body, no blood, no struggle, just abandoned equipment, and the clear record of someone's descent into the particular insanity that comes from watching something you can't classify while understanding that it's watching you back. I radioed West Glacier with careful professionalism. A backpacker, apparently unauthorized, missing equipment, likely injuries, search and rescue imperative. They responded with the same distant authority. They'd process a missing person report, send in SAR teams. But given the incomplete information and the passage of time, I should mark the site for evidence collection and continue my regular patrols. Nobody could reach Ravine Camp for 3 weeks. The park was understaffed. Budgets were cut. This was normal. That night I hung a lantern from the cabin porch and sat outside with the rifle I'd brought from the emergency supplies. I didn't sleep. I listened to the sounds of the forest, the wind, the water, the small movements of legitimate wildlife, and underneath it all, at the edge of perception, other sounds. Sounds that seemed to move between the trees around the cabin in a way that suggested deliberate investigation rather than random passing. By the time the moon rose, I understood Vessie's resignation. Some knowledge, once gained, can't be unknown. Once you understand that something vast and wrongly shaped moves through the darkness with your observation as its focus, normalcy becomes impossible. The SAR team arrived on June 28th, 3 experienced searchers with dogs, supported by a junior ranger named Pierce, who'd drawn the short straw for Ravine Camp support duty. Pierce was 24, enthusiastic, and dangerous in the way that youth combined with inadequate experience becomes dangerous. He looked at the abandoned camp and saw a legitimate rescue scenario. He looked at my documentation of the tracks and the carcasses and saw interesting wildlife behavior. He didn't see what I'd learned to see, that we were not the investigators here, but the subjects. The team stayed for a week. They expanded their search grid daily, following the ridge systems and ravines, calling out for the missing DM. The dogs picked up scents that led nowhere, in circles, back on themselves. The team leader, a woman named Reeves with 15 years of SAR experience, developed a tight expression as the search extended past the point of expected discovery. On the 5th day, one of the dog handlers came back to camp alone, pale and trembling. His dog had stopped responding to commands, had gone rigid pointing toward the east ravine, and had bolted despite years of training. "It's nothing," Reeves said, but she'd begun sleeping with her pistol. That night I heard it for the first time, the sound that would embed itself in my memory the way certain experiences do, unchangeable and persistent. It came from the ravine, perhaps a mile away, perhaps less in the dark. It was a sound like wind through a too small space. It was a sound like something breathing that had too many lungs. It was a sound like someone calling across an enormous distance in a voice that had worn away most of its humanity. Pierce sat up in his bedroll, hand moving toward his flashlight. "Don't," I said. "Don't acknowledge it." "What the hell was that?" His voice had found its real register, uncertain, young, afraid. "Something that doesn't want us investigating the ravine anymore." In the morning, Reeves made the call. The search was suspended pending additional resources. The SAR team would return to West Glacier and file their report. They'd recommend that the missing person case be classified as a low-probability recovery, likely death by exposure or accident, with the body potentially lost in the extensive ravine system. "Someone will come back," Reeves told me quietly as they packed. "Someone with more people, someone with better equipment, because something happened to that person, and we're not equipped to investigate it properly. No one will come back, I said. You'll file your report. It'll be reviewed. Someone will note that the park's too large and the resources too thin. You're the fourth team to come look for something in that area in 2 years if you count the original ranger and the private hunter and the other mismatched pieces. There's something here. You know there's something here. Yes, I said. And it's learning that official responses are slow and ineffective. The team left in the afternoon. Piers stayed another night at my insistence. I couldn't let him hike out alone, and left at first light the following morning. He promised to tell his supervisors that Ranger Crowfeather was stable and that the situation required trained personnel and appropriate resources. He was a good kid. I hoped he'd have the good sense to request a station transfer. Alone again, the cabin transformed into something else. Not a refuge, but a cage. I had supplies for 6 months. I had a radio with spotty reception. I had a rifle, a first aid kit, and an encyclopedic knowledge of a territory that was slowly revealing itself to be inhabited by something I couldn't place in any standard ecological framework. The tracks grew bolder. In early July, I found them literally circling the cabin, a complete circumnavigation made in a single night, the enormous feet pressed into the soft earth with what seemed like controlled pressure, suggesting observation rather than aggression. But observation is its own form of threat. I also found remains. The previous ranger had left something in his final log, the mention of extreme disarticulation that he'd interpreted as wolverine predation. I now understood that interpretation had been chosen for its normalcy, its acceptability, because disarticulation could also mean something with hands, something with a systematic approach to dismantling prey, something that understood the structure of bone and sinew well enough to separate them with precision. The goats and elk had progressed to smaller animals, marmots, ground squirrels, a family of pikas found arranged in the rocky shelter of a peak like offerings at an altar, and the scat changed, becoming more consistent, more frequent, more focused around specific territories that radiated outward from the ravines. Mid-July brought the sounds closer. Every night now, the voice, that terrible wind through broken places sound, echoed from different locations. It was circling. It was learning the territory better. It was establishing dominance not through attack, but through demonstration of presence. On July 18th, I found the journal. It was mine, or rather it had been blank when I arrived, and I'd begun writing in it to maintain my sanity, recording observations in the careful format of an actual ranger, rather than the increasingly unraveled pattern of my private fear. Someone had taken the journal from the cabin, read it, and left it on a rock about 300 yards from the front door. The pages had been carefully returned in correct order, but the margins contained notes, written in something dark that might have been mud or blood, in a hand that was roughly formed but undeniably intentional. The letters spelled out observations of my observations, corrections, confirmations, a running commentary on my tracking of it written in a parody of language that suggested understanding without communication. On the final page where I'd written my daily log entry, there was a drawing. It was crude but unmistakable. A stick figure inside a square, the cabin, surrounded by a much larger figure with disproportionate arms and a head that seemed to contain more than it should. Below it, a single word, labored but clear, soon. I packed a bag. I was leaving, not requesting reassignment, actually leaving, walking out through the high country toward Browning if I had to, moving through daylight only, avoiding the ravines. I made it 2 miles before I understood the trap. The realization came with the same sudden clarity as recognizing a face in a crowd. I wasn't being hunted opportunistically, I was being herded. Every path I chose, every direction I attempted, corresponded with sounds from the ravines that subtly redirected my course back toward the center of the territory. I was being led. I retreated to the cabin and made a decision that had no good outcome but was the only decision that changed the dynamic from passive to active. I would go into the ravines. I took the rifle, 2 days of supplies, and the headlamp that had arrived in the SAR team's cargo. I took the journal that had been returned to me, and I descended into the territory where all the signs led, where the tracks converged, where the sound seemed to originate. The ravines of the northern glacier backcountry descend in switchbacks and sudden drops. The geological history is exposed in the layered rock. Precambrian stones pushed upward by forces that ended before humans evolved, now gullied and worn by 10,000 years of water. The shadows deepen as you descend. The air grows cooler, and the signs become clearer. The stripped carcasses increase in frequency, the tracks become so numerous they overlap, and the sense of occupation becomes absolute. I found the den in a natural cavern formation, a wound in the mountainside that exhaled cold and something else, a smell like burned animal and spoiled meat, and something acrid that my brain refused to process completely. The cavity was vast. I could see shapes inside, things that had been arranged, but my light wouldn't penetrate far enough to construct a complete picture. And then a sound emerged from that darkness that was different from the wind voice. It was breathing, real breathing, something large, acclimating to the presence of another consciousness. "I know what you are," I called out. My voice sounded thin and small against the stone. The breathing stopped. In the silence I understood something with absolute certainty. It understood language. Perhaps not in the way I understood it, but in some way that extended beyond animal cognition, beyond pure instinct. "You were human once," I said, "or something was human once. Someone came into your territory and didn't leave, and something changed." The darkness shifted. I raised the rifle, though I had no confidence it would serve any purpose beyond its psychological benefit to me. What emerged was impossible to process as a coherent image. My mind refused to hold it, rejected it, tried to parse it as a combination of things I understood: fur and hairlessness in wrong proportions, bulk without distinct boundaries, limbs that seemed to articulate in extra places, a face that was almost there, almost human, almost comprehensible, with eyes that reflected the headlamp light in a way that suggested recognition, assessment, judgment. It moved with liquid speed despite its size. The rifle shot was instinctive, panic response. The round entered what might have been the shoulder. The creature made a sound that was between a shriek and that terrible wind voice, echoing off the ravine walls until the air itself seemed in pain. It didn't attack. Instead, it retreated into the deeper dark of the cavern, the breathing resuming, controlled again, almost methodical. And I understood what I'd done. I'd confirmed hostile intent. I'd escalated from observation to violence. I'd proven that I was capable of being a threat, which meant it would now treat me as a threat. I left the ravine slowly, rifle forward, watching the darkness behind me. The breathing followed me upward, keeping pace, never attacking, never rushing, just maintaining presence. When I broke into daylight again several hours later, I was beyond exhaustion. My hands shook as I climbed the final switchbacks back toward the cabin, and I knew that rescue was no longer possible. Not because no one would come, but because when they came, the presence in the ravines would demonstrate why no one should stay. The next morning, I submitted my transfer request via radio. Medical leave, psychological assessment required. Unsuitable for isolated posting. West Glacier took 3 days to process it. The helicopter arrived on July 26th. As I climbed aboard, I looked back at Ravine Camp, at the lake, at the silent forest that had revealed the depth of its occupation only to me. The wind moved through the trees in patterns that suggested attention. I've been back in Portland for 6 months now. I have a new job that requires nothing but driving between office buildings. I don't sleep well. Sounds from the street outside my apartment occasionally seem wrongly pitched. Sometimes I catch movement in my peripheral vision that might be tracks, that might be observation. And sometimes, very late at night, I dream of the ravines. Not nightmares exactly, something more like remembering. And in those dreams, the creature is no longer in Glacier. It's learned to move beyond its territory. It's learned that the world extends past the mountains. It's learning to follow, to observe, to wait. Last week, I found a second journal on my apartment doorstep. It had been left there while I slept. Inside, in that same labored hand, in that same dark substance, it carried one message repeated on every page: still here, still watching, never stopped. I moved apartments. It found me in the new place within a week. I think about Vesey sometimes. I think about DM huddled in that unauthorized camp with 14 rounds and impossible odds. I think about Pierce, who went back to his family in Seattle and probably sleeps fine. The ravine keeps what it takes, and some things it takes very slowly, across months and years and all the distance in between. I know this because I can feel it getting closer. The scratching at my walls at 3 a.m. that the landlord insists is just rats. The way my coworkers step away from me, as if sensing something that doesn't belong in normal spaces. The sound in the vents on cold nights that almost sounds like breathing. I'm leaving Portland. I'm going north, toward the wilderness. I think the only way to make this end is to go back to where it started, to return to the ravines, to finally discover whether understanding what lives there is the same as joining it, and whether survival is even the correct metric for what I might become.